Hola, ¿cómo estás? Espero que estés súper bien. This is Tamara Marie, host of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. Now, before we jump into this episode, I wanted to let you know about a special opportunity that you're definitely going to want to take advantage of, especially if your goal is to become fluent in Spanish. For a limited time only, my team is opening the doors to listeners of the podcast to take advantage of a free language coaching session. Now, in this session, it's not just we're teaching you about verbs or grammar, but we're really going to do a deep dive into what are your goals for learning Spanish, assess where you are on your journey to fluency at the moment, and help you map out a 90-day plan for how you can get to fluency. So we are going to help you take your Spanish to the next level, whether you're afraid of speaking Spanish or you just get a little bit nervous when you're talking to native speakers, or maybe you've got some of the basics down, but you really know that you struggle with getting your Spanish to flow and your listening skills aren't up to par. Whatever it is, even if it is a specific grammar issue, we will help you map out how to tackle that. And normally these sessions do cost, so we are offering a few slots for free. There are limited spaces available and they'll only be open up through the end of the month. So make sure you sign up. Go to SpanishConSalsa.com/coach. That's SpanishConSalsa.com/coach to book your free language coaching session where we will help you map out a 90-day plan to get to Spanish fluency. Okay, let's get started with the episode. Before you book your next flight to a Spanish-speaking country, you definitely don't want to miss this conversation with Jamarr Black. Jamarr left his job as a technical writer in Washington, D.C. to move to Cali, Colombia. He talks about how he managed to get a $5 flight to Colombia, and he hasn't looked back since. He also shares his top recommendations for what you should do to prepare yourself before you embark on complete immersion in a Spanish-speaking country. I hope you enjoy this latest installment in our Black Expat series. Así que vamos a empezar. Let's get started.
Bienvenidos! Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast, the show for Spanish learners that love music, travel, and culture. Close your grammar textbooks, shut down the language apps, and open your ears to how Spanish is spoken in the real world. Let us show you how to go from beginner to bilingual. Here is your host, certified language coach, Tamara Marie.
Hola y bienvenidos al episodio 101. Welcome to episode 101 of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. In this latest installment of our Black Expat series, we are going to explore the nation of Colombia in South America. I have a conversation with Jamarr Black. He is a teacher and also a tour guide for Hola Cali in the country and the city where he lives right now in Cali, Colombia. Jamarr shares how he overcame the frustration of being the only non-native Spanish speaker in a conversation and not understanding what was happening around him. He also gives the steps that he took when he moved to Colombia and even before he moved there to prepare himself to live in an environment where there just aren't many English speakers. He also talks about some of the different Colombian Spanish accents, and he shares some caleño Spanish terms that you definitely won't find in Google Translate. So with that, I hope you enjoy part one of my conversation with Jamarr Black. Hola, Jamarr. Bienvenido a Spanish con Salsa. Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
Hello. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to join me. I know that I found you on Instagram or somewhere on Facebook in a discussion about, what it was like to be Black living in Colombia. So I thought you'd be perfect to have on the podcast because I have listeners always asking me, I've been thinking about moving abroad. Should I move? Should I take the jump? So I'm doing this whole series with Black Expats to really find out what are the differences for moving and living abroad when you are a person of African descent, because it is a little bit different, unfortunately, and sometimes fortunately, than it is if you are from a different background. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the podcast. And to start out, could you just sort of introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit about you?
Yes. So my name is Jamarr. I go by the Afro Expat on Instagram, where I try to focus on like educational material, sometimes activism, and mostly authentic experiences and content and advice about living in another country, specifically in Colombia, since this is where I'm based. I'm originally from North Carolina. I spent some time in Washington, D.C. as well, about 6 years. But Colombia showed up on my radar shortly after completing a study abroad program and moving to Washington, D.C. So everything just seemed to be connected and landed. Yeah, I'm here in Cali, Colombia, and I'm a teacher. I teach 7th and 8th grade at a private school here, and I also am a collaborator of Hola Cali, a founder actually. Hola Cali is like a resource for people who are looking for information in English about Cali when they come here. So I run that with a friend of mine from Canada, and focusing on at the Afro Expat nowadays. I want to like connect with other expats and people who are interested in moving abroad.
Wow, so you sound like you are pretty busy, right? You have a lot going on down there in Cali.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep myself busy.
I'm curious, though, because you said you're from North Carolina. So, being from the U.S., I think we all have had that experience where, at some point in school, someone tells you that you have to pick a foreign language as an elective. And usually, for most people that I hear, in my experience as well, is that the way language is taught in school is not always the best way and usually doesn't result in you being fluent in the language. So I'm sure, moving to Colombia, you have to, be able to get by in Spanish. So could you talk a little bit about how you started language learning, how you learned Spanish in preparation for your move to Colombia? Because I imagine that the language barrier is probably a really big factor for a lot of people who think about moving abroad, and especially listeners of this podcast who are already trying to learn Spanish and really want to become fluent.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Like before moving to Colombia, I didn't consider how the language barrier might impact my life here, but it's not until you're fully immersed and, you're still trying to learn, but, it's kind of stuck in a place where you're around native speakers and you don't always understand. So, it's definitely a process. For me, my steps to learning Spanish were basically like having basic knowledge. Like I had something to build off of. By the time I was in high school, you could either choose Spanish or French, and I just chose Spanish because that's what I was already on the trajectory of. So yeah, like having that basic knowledge for me before moving here, like even knowing how to say hola or introduce myself, just because it was like second nature to have like some basic phrases, basic words that you know. And from there, I think I always had like an inclination to or curiosity to want to learn new words, just because I always had that basic knowledge. But I've always struggled with listening comprehension because, like you said, in schools, they don't really teach you how to, listen for dialects or that there's different accents and things like that. For me, listening comprehension has always been a struggle. I would say another point would be a willingness to speak and make mistakes, because that for me has helped me a lot, because I think that I don't worry so much about being correct or being corrected, because I kind of look forward to being corrected, if anything, so that I can kind of make a note of it, so I can not make that same mistake, even though I constantly make the same mistakes. You also have to understand that it's a process. I remember being the only native speaker sometimes, getting upset because I didn't understand what everybody was talking about. Now that I understand more, years later, I just understand it's a process and it takes time, so that kind of keeps me grounded. And then also, I would say, just being fully immersed in the culture here has helped me, because when I first started, communicating with people, it was via text messages, and I relied heavily on reading and writing, because that was my strong points. Yeah, having friends, native Spanish speaking friends to message with, and I naturally gravitate towards Google Translate, even though I know that the translations aren't 100% correct, and that sometimes it's taken out of context. Paying attention to words and synonyms and things like that, just making notes whenever I'm translating text messages from WhatsApp, keeping my subtitles on for Netflix, even if I'm not listening in Spanish, which I shouldn't, since my listening comprehension is not the best. I normally keep the subtitles on in Spanish and listen in English, just so I can continue building that vocabulary. And then I've also changed. I go back and forth changing my telephone in Spanish and English. And I think by seeing words that you see every day in English and then recognizing them also in Spanish can help. But yeah, those are my three things. Like, I'm having a basic knowledge, willingness to speak and make mistakes, and like immerse yourself as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think it's some of the things you mentioned in terms of immersion are things you can do before you even travel or move. Like you mentioned, switching the language on your phone. It's a lot of things. I know that's a thing a lot of people try. And, I always tell people, make sure you know the word for language, idioma, before you do that, so that you can always switch it back. If you get lost, you don't want to wipe your phone clean. But yeah, I think some of those things are things we could start to do even before, even if like right now, travel is not as plentiful as it has been in the past for a number of reasons. So people might be thinking, well, how do I do immersion if I can't go and do a homestay with a family for, 3 months right now? Well, you can do some things. I remember I had a friend and we would always text back and forth in Spanish. And when we met, I was speaking to him in English and he says, well, wait a minute. I thought you were like a native speaker based on like our texting. Why don't you want to talk to me in Spanish? And I think it's a good start to be able to think like you're in a conversation, to get that texting in. And also because you have that lag time, right? You can actually sit and read like the WhatsApp message and translate it. So it's like sort of real time, but it's like a delay, right? You have that time. I think that can prepare you to think through a conversation so that when you get to that point where you feel comfortable and like you said, not being afraid to make those mistakes, that kind of just going through that sort of back and forth and having to like translate those basic things like, oh, wait a minute, or, oh, I can't hear you, your phone's breaking up, like stuff like that we don't think about because it's not like really in a textbook anywhere, that you learn those things and you get comfortable with those things as you start to have some of those interactions. So I think those are some great tips. And I also would I would encourage people to use the voice note feature. If you're using WhatsApp or any of these language exchange apps, don't punk out and just do text. Like, you can use voice notes and that'll give you time to listen. So I think for listening comprehension, that also helps because people tend to leave like these short messages and then you can kind of listen to them over and over again. So that's something that can also help you ease in the conversation. So
repetition is key. I think having the ability to like, for instance, like for me, like with the writing, being able to see that and having it saved there, it's the same concept with the voice messages, like you said, like being able to go back and listen as many times as you need to until you start to hear what is supposed to be said. I mean, I think having captions like of like what's being said as you're listening is always very helpful. I find that Netflix sometimes doesn't always have the exact translation because I think those translations come from Spain most of the time. And like, let's say you're in Latin America where they speak completely differently, you might not pick up exactly what's being said.
Well, tell me a little bit about that, because you mentioned dialects, and that's something that I also, focus a lot on the podcast and then just in the courses that we provide, because I focus a lot on learning Spanish through music, but with that comes all of the culture and all of the different dialects that are spoken in all these different countries, because they are pretty different. Spanish is Spanish, yes, but there are definitely variations not only in vocabulary but also in accent and intonation that can make it more difficult to understand spoken Spanish, especially if you're not used to that particular accent. So for you, before you moved to Colombia, had you been exposed to other dialects of Spanish that you were more comfortable with, or did you find any differences in traveling and then ultimately when you moved to Colombia to hear how Spanish was spoken there?
Well, let me give you a little bit of context in terms of like how long I've been speaking Spanish and like on this journey. So like in 2014 was my first time moving here. I can say when I came in 2014, I never had any types of exposure to like when it comes to like speaking with natives, like or anything like that. Like there was nothing that I found familiar. I think that I had Spanish teachers that came from like Spain. I had one from Spain and then the others were like African Americans. Like I think that maybe if anything, Mexican Spanish or Spanglish would be recognizable just so I could hear how the words pronunciated. Like for instance, like in Colombia, you have so many different accents just within Colombia. In the north coast and the Caribbean coast, they speak very, very fast. Like they say, like people from the south speak fast. Like, I think that's around the same comparison to how Spanish is spoken there. So like even the Colombians that I know here in Cali in this region, like they can't understand people who are costeños or people from the coast. So I also have, like when I travel over there, I have a hard time understanding those dialects. But now that I've been in Cali in this region, like for so long, it's been going on 6 years now. I have their Hertigas, which is like slang. I've learned how to use different idioms that they use. And like sometimes I surprise people who didn't expect this, understand Spanish, because I speak the dialect of Spanish from this region. But when it comes to listening to people from other regions, sometimes I have a hard time. I think that people in Bogota, they have the like clearer Spanish, so that I tend to understand them more.
And I think one of the things that you mentioned that I think is really important is that there are native Spanish speakers that are in Cali who have trouble understanding people from the coast. And I think that's encouraging because as language learners, I think we expect perfection, or at least I'll speak for myself as a recovering perfectionist. It's like, we think, okay, I'm supposed to understand 100% of everything I hear 100% of the time. And if I don't, I'm not fluent, right? And setting the bar that high is not only putting, hard on yourself or putting pressure on yourself, but it's also just not realistic, right? I mean, everybody is from somewhere, and I'm from the East Coast of the U.S. Now, there's certain things that people say in the Deep South or on the West Coast that I don't understand, right? Because there are terms that they might use that I'm not familiar with. So I think, using that standard in Spanish is, I think, a little bit unfair. So I like that you mentioned that, and also that you have that awareness that you are really comfortable with that one specific dialect in Cali, because that's what you've been exposed to, right? Which is the same thing that happens with native speakers as well. So hopefully that's encouraging to folks who are feeling like, oh, I don't understand this particular thing or that thing. Well, I always encourage people to get familiar with that one dialect or one accent and just be comfortable with that and let that be your home base, because otherwise it's very difficult to improve your listening comprehension because you're trying to understand everyone, and that's, I think, a difficult task to undertake. So
yeah, and don't compare yourself to native speakers, like too. I think that also puts pressure on you to like try to like categorize yourself as somebody who's like fluent or beginner. Like I never thought of myself in that way when I'm speaking in Spanish. And like you said, like I've always been the type to like focus on just like that one dialect that I know, and then like the more you get comfortable with that dialect, you'll start to understand other accents. For instance, like for me, I can distinguish the Venezuelan accent very easily because like one, it's hard for me to understand, two, like they have like a distinct rhythm when they speak. Yeah, I think that always having like that ground or that basic knowledge of that one dialect is key.
Okay, and since you mentioned that you have picked up some of the dialect from Cali, because I have not been to Cali, so what's one of your favorite phrases or idioms that you picked up since you've been there?
Listo apoyo is what they say whenever they're ready. Like, oh, listo. Like normally it's like listo. It's like when you're ready, but then they'll like just throw in listo apoyo. It's just like it's very like caleño. Bendito sea Dios, alabado sea su santo nombre. God is good all the time, and all the time God is good. So that's like what I understood that to be. Like, just talking to my partner, like we speak Spanish only, primarily. Like I pick up a lot of different idioms from speaking with him. Me sacas de quicio. You get on my nerves. No se vaya por las ramas. Don't beat around the bush. So yeah, all those, I have like a whole list. I'm not gonna go over all of them, but like it's interesting because like you'll try to do the direct translation or whatever in Google or whatever translator you use, and like you get something completely different. But like when somebody speaks to you and you get the context of what they're saying, like you can kind of like then translate it from English, like from your own understanding of the context.
Yeah, context is very important. I'm glad you mentioned that as well, because I think one of the things that usually confuses people when they're trying to translate, even if you're using a good source, not Google Translate, sorry. It has gotten better over the years, but it's not my go-to. But if you use even a good dictionary, if you don't have the full context, it can be difficult even then to translate. So I always recommend that people, if you get a translation that doesn't make sense, when you put everything in and it's translating word for word, then try to put it in as a whole phrase and see if you're able to get a better translation. Because I think that, none of the apps are perfect. Nothing's ever going to be as good as a human being, thinking through that. But sometimes you can make sure you have the phrases in there. But even then, you don't always find everything in the generic dictionary. So That's been one of my ongoing struggles with Spanish, and also why I spent so much time delving into the dialects and talking about them, so that people get that exposure and realize that there is this huge diversity in what's called, quote unquote, Latin American Spanish, but it's actually so many different countries and cultures. So I'm curious, how is it that you from North Carolina to DC area, how did you decide to move to Cali, of all places, not just, Colombia, but Cali specifically? And how was that process for you?
So I went to UNC Wilmington. That does not have a large amount of like Black students, let alone any Black students, many Black students that were studying abroad during that time. I happened to have a roommate in college that wanted to go to South Africa and was like, oh, we should go to South Africa. During the time, like, my mom had been recently ill, and like I was not really trying to go too far away where I wouldn't be able to be in reach of her. I opted for a program to go to Finland for 2 months, 2 month study abroad program in human sciences. And in Finland, I chose Finland because it was free education. Like, basically, all I had to pay for was like my transportation and my lodging while I was there. So like, I did like the economical short option. But then from there, that's when my travel bug started. Like, so like, my school heard about me being like a Black male going abroad in Finland. So they offered me a scholarship through the Ralph Bunche Scholarship in conjunction with like another scholarship from the State Department, Gilman Scholarship. I was able to go to South Africa and spend 6 months abroad. By that time, my mom was already like in a better condition, so I didn't have any problems leaving. Through that scholarship, Ralph Bunche, like, after coming back from South Africa, I went directly to DC, kind of like not by choice, because I kind of missed my flight on the way back from South Africa, going through Barcelona, and ended up having to get some help from my grandma, who ended up buying me a ticket to where she was, which was in DC. So like, I landed in DC, started my career from there, like as a technical writer, but also had Ralph Bunche in mind, because as I was trying to start my career, I knew Ralph Phelps Stoke, which was also a part of Ralph Bunche Society. So I had them in mind as, a recent scholar that maybe they could help me find a job or help me find opportunities. So I ended up volunteering while I was in DC for a Latino youth project that was connected with Phelps Stokes, Ralph Bunche. While I was doing that, that was my first time ever getting like an inkling of Colombia, because like one of the organizers that we were on an excursion with the kids one day was telling me, oh, maybe one day, I think he said he was from Choco. He said maybe one day come to Colombia, go to Choco. It's like a department of like mostly Black people. I'd never heard of Colombia. It was on my map at that time. But like, he just mentioned that, since you're a writer, maybe you can go to Colombia and write one day. And I just always had that in the back of my mind. Meanwhile, like, I'm working in DC as a technical writer. As soon as I got back from South Africa, I was looking for the first way possible to travel again. So I started looking into jobs as a flight attendant or working for an airline, because I wanted to get those benefits. And so I had that on my radar. I got a job as a part-time job as a gate agent. Stayed working with U.S. Airways for like 3 years. So I was always like back and forth, like taking these short trips when I had time off for cheap. Like, I think I went to Israel for like $40 round trip. Oh, wow. Yeah, so I ended up getting exhausted though, like, with the political climate and everything that was going on. I think that Trayvon was like, 2012. I think that's when we first started getting like this big wave of like violence against Black people all over again since Rodney King. I don't think we've heard of it that intensely. So like, that was in the news, and I think that I was just kind of like just exhausted and feeling like I wanted to live abroad again. So I had a friend that had lived in Cali. I was curious about Colombia, and just in the nick of time when I was getting laid off of both of my jobs, like an email came through inviting me to teach English with Atlas course.
I hope you enjoyed part 1 of my conversation with Jamarr. And if you want to get in touch with him, you can reach out to him on Instagram at the Afro Expat. Make sure that you're subscribed to this podcast if you want to hear part 2 of our conversation next week. Jamarr talks about safety in Colombia and how Americans are treated by the police. And he also talks a little bit about the cost of living and the nightlife in Cali. So make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you'll be the first to know when we release our episode next Tuesday. So with that, I hope that something you've heard has helped you go one step closer from Spanish beginner to bilingual. See you next week. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you for listening to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast at learnspanishconsalsa.com.